Welcome to Legal Nurse Podcast. My name is Pat Iyer, and I am the hostess of Legal Nurse Podcast. We have been broadcasting weekly since 2016, and we are the original legal nurse consulting podcast. I look at the people I meet and say, who can I bring to you who can provide you with some tips and perspective that you can use in your business? Today, I am bringing you a neuro humorist, and we'll talk about what that term means, who enjoys traveling the globe, helping nurses with burnout and maintaining their sense of humor. She's also an avid fan of Comic Con, which I will ask her to explain in a minute. My guest today is Karyn Buxman, and Karyn is a registered nurse and somebody I've met through National Speakers Association and through another group I'm involved with called Stark Raving Entrepreneurs, where our focus is on speaking skills and artificial intelligence. Karyn, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Pat. I'm just really jazzed to be here today.
Thank you. Well, first of all, we'll ask about Comic Con because I know that may not be a term that is familiar to everybody who is going to watch this on our YouTube channel, Legal Nurse Business, or listen to it on our audio channels.
Well, if they've ever watched Big Bang Theory, they may have heard of Comic-Con, but Comic-Con is this wonderfully delightful, it's a conference, it's an event that takes place in San Diego once a year, and 140,000 comic nerds join in one place. And it started, I don't know, I think close to 50 years ago. And it was just this little tiny trade show about comic books. And it grew and grew and grew and started bringing in experts on art and not just art around comics, but fantasy and then science fiction. And it just continued to grow. And then they started bringing in producers and directors and actors and all of these other people and new releases. And now it's just it's a huge annual event. And my husband and I have been going for about 20 years. And so love me. And a dirty little secret, I really like zombies. So if there's ever a zombie apocalypse, you want me on your team.
Every once in a while, I stumble upon a novel which is about zombies and how the world is being destroyed by some dread virus, and
Yeah.
then people are fighting with each other over scarce resources, and there are corpses that are lining up in the streets. And after reading a few of those, I thought, I think I'll go back to my serial mass murder mystery stories that I enjoy more than zombie stories.
I don't know. I kind of starting to look vaguely like our current healthcare system. I don't know.
And there are still bodies piling up in the streets in the serial mass murder novels that I read too, which are sometimes based on true stories.
Yeah.
We started this podcast talking about the fact that you're a neuro humorist. Tell our listener, what does that term mean?
I live at the intersection of humor and the brain. In my nursing background, like probably many of your listeners and viewers, we started out in many different areas. I loved the ones that particularly were high adrenaline, the ER, OR, ICU. I did some air ambulance. I've done a variety of different kinds of things. And then I went into teaching and I taught OB, peds, geriatrics, mental health, and I know some people are thinking, oh, you couldn't hold a job, but I loved learning. And when I went back to grad school and needed to do a thesis and a research project, I stumbled across this little paragraph by a nurse researcher. It was in the back of a nursing journal, Vera Robinson, who later became my mentor and then my friend. And I ran across where she had done her dissertation on the use of humor with Native American Indians and health. And it was just such a whack upside the head, and immediately let my advisors know that I was changing all of the direction of my thesis and my research project. And as I continue to do this, it has led me from audiences of less than 10 to more than 10,000, and from Burbank to Bangkok. And I ended up with so many demands and requests. When people started hearing what I was studying, they were like, "Oh, we want you to come share that." And I remember the very first time I went to an event and I was going to share the p-value of less than 0.05 to this audience, and they thought I was funny. It's like, who knew? But as I have then stepped into that nurse entrepreneurial role, as many of your listeners and viewers have, this ended up being my full-time vocation. I thought I'll try speaking for a year. If it works out, I'll do it another year. If not, I'll go back. And every year, with the exception of COVID, was just better and more fun than the year before. And that was back in around 1990, oof, which is probably before some of your listeners were even born. And over the last, I'd say 10 to 15 years, I really started looking at the how humor affects the brain and vice versa. I was dear friends with a researcher, Dr. Lee Burke, who studied humor and the brain and came up with some very, very interesting insights that I'm sure we're going to get into here shortly. And the I knew what many of the outcomes and benefits were of humor, but I didn't necessarily understand why these things were happening. And once I looked at that intersection of humor and the brain, again, it explained so much. And so I'm eager to share this with you and the folks who are listening in.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about how important it is to have a sense of humor when you work in healthcare.
Yes.
I had a mother who worked in the emergency department who would come home and tell me stories about people who injured themselves. I remember vividly the man who was casting a fishing line and put the fish hook embedded into his neck, where there are a lot of vital structures on the side of your neck. And he came in with this hook sticking out, and a variety of other ways that people can injure themselves. How does humor help us get through some of the darker moments that we experience as nurses, as legal nurse consultants?
Boy, that is a great question. And where to begin? I almost want to go back to our Comic-Con explanation, or just when we're visiting about that, because I said I love zombies, and there was a time once where they had this display from Walking Dead, and it was almost the size of a city block, and they had chain link fence around it and all these real looking zombies, and they were in character, and they're moaning and groaning and grabbing at people, but they're behind the fence. And I would just spend hours watching these zombies. I was so fascinated. And one day they announced it's time for everybody to go, but I wanted one more look at my zombies. And so I went back, and because it was over, they were opening the fence and zombies were coming out in character. Two zombies spy me, and they start walking toward me. And at first, my prefrontal cortex is going, "Oh my gosh, this is just like being in the show. This is just so cool." And on the other hand, my emotional, system, my limbic system is going, "Oh, this is kind of scary." Your chest gets a little bit tight. But the one zombie getting closer and closer. And again, my prefrontal cortex is going, "Look at that. It looks just like you can see that his face is kind of sliding off, and look at the makeup. This is incredible." And now my stomach is rolling, and it's getting a little more difficult to breathe. And my limbic system is going, "Let's get the heck out of here." And the zombie keeps getting closer and closer and closer. It looks like he can almost touch me. And by now, my prefrontal cortex is trying to tell me that this isn't real, but my amygdala is going, "We're gonna die. Leave." And so I turn around to run, and the second zombie had snuck up behind me. And I screamed like I was a little girl. I absolutely lost it. Blood curdling scream that people all throughout the convention center heard. Why did that happen? My prefrontal cortex knew that that wasn't real. However, my brain got hijacked. And so many times when we're in those dark situations, our brains can get hijacked. And there's just this cascade of things that happen when that occurs, including losing our ability to problem solve, to be creative, to do all the things that we need to be able to do as nurses. And so to be able to reverse that amygdala hijack, there's several things that you can do, but nurses seem to know intuitively that one of the quick ways to unhijack your amygdala is to provide a brain break through humor. Now, I will say with the caveat, I mean, nurses have a great sense of humor. I love visiting with nurses. However, a lot of nursing humor involves body fluids, death, and dismemberment. And I'll tell you why. I have learned through my years and years and years of research that the closer we are to tragedy and death, the darker our humor becomes. And so there are certain kinds of nuances and right practices that we need to know so that we can use it effectively for those whom we're serving and for ourselves. But it is a great stress reliever, and it really does help us in terms of our cognitive capacity.
And for us who are in business working with attorneys, the equivalent of the crisis in the ER for
Yeah.
us is the phone call from the unhappy attorney who is yelling, who's putting us into that scary situation. That attorney might be equivalent to the zombie who's advancing on you without
Yes.
warning. You get the phone call, and the attorney is yelling, and you're caught off guard.
Yeah.
Maybe humor is not an appropriate response at that moment. Take us through from the from the neurophysiology perspective of this. First of all, the yelling behavior that we are the recipient of. And
Yeah.
let me be very clear, this is not something that happens every day. If
Yeah.
you have an attorney calling you every day, yelling at you, you've got a quality issue, or your clients are not the people you should be working with. But having,
Exactly.
having run a very large and successful business for many years, these are rare instances, but every time they happen, they are profoundly disturbing. We
Yes.
want to please attorneys. We want them to be happy with us. We are nurses. We are there to care for other people. And when
Right.
somebody is screaming, it's very hard to deal with. So give us some perspective, if you could, on handling that scary situation.
Again, another great question, Pat. And I want to say that when somebody is yelling and it's consistent, again, to your point, hopefully that is not the case, because now you definitely want to question about whether or not you want to be working with this person, because that tends to more often than not be a learned behavior. And they may fall into that again and again and again. They may not have the awareness, and maybe they don't even have the communication abilities. But with lawyers, you would think that they are more articulate and they would have more than just one tool in their toolbox. This is often a a response to try to regain power or control of a situation. And so oftentimes this comes out of a feeling of loss of control. And with that, ultimately, it's fear. Therein also some kind of an amygdala hijack. And when you're faced with that suddenly, now you're thrown into that threat response with the brain too. And that can, if one of the parties doesn't take some positive action, you're very likely to have this escalate into a situation that may very well, most likely, not have a very good outcome. And so I think that it's up to the nurse in that situation to take control of that. And I my I think my favorite quote of all time came from Viktor Frankl. And he was a Holocaust survivor, if that name doesn't sound familiar to you, wrote a book that everyone should read at least once in their lifetime called Man's Search for Meaning. But he said something very profound, and he said, between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space lies our power to choose our response. And in that response lies our freedom and our happiness. We often, in that space, stimulus, somebody yelling at us, response, we want to go into a knee jerk and respond back. But if you can put something in that space, oftentimes it's a breath, a pause. That in itself can help you regain some cognitive capacity to name without blaming what's going on. You're yelling, and it's difficult for me to understand what the issue is here. It may mean that you have to set a boundary. Let's continue this call later when we're both in a better space. And to your point, humor is often can be a very effective piece, but it is something that can also cause things to blow up. And there's a number of factors that come into play. I spend lengthy sessions with people talking to them about what other factors do you need to be aware of when you're using humor for influence or health, not just for entertainment. And so, if you want to be sure in terms of psychological safety and other kinds of issues, you may want to wait on using humor at that particular moment. But giving something and putting something in that space to allow things to de-escalate is something that will be very helpful. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I'm thinking that sarcastic humor might not work well with somebody who's quite angry and may not understand or may react to the sarcasm.
I love that you brought up sarcasm. When I talk to people and I ask them, what kinds of humor do you like? Sarcasm is frequently one of the top things. And I love a good bit of sarcasm too. Sarcasm is actually a very aggressive kind of humor.
Mm.
The root word of sarcasm actually means to tear the flesh. And if you've ever been hit with an effective piece of sarcasm, you may remember what that can feel like. It is an aggressive kind. And here's what you need for sarcasm to be positive or enjoyable, and that is trust. When you have that connection and when you have that trust, so that the other person knows that there is psychological safety. If they know that there's psychological safety, you've been friends for years, they know that this is not a mean-spirited kind of thing to try to diminish you, then the sarcasm becomes playful banter, which can be very fun.
Mm-hmm.
In those instances where the other person doesn't know you well enough, or there isn't that psychological safety established or that trust established, then you need to wait and use your sarcasm at another time.
I know that one of my coaches taught me not to say yes, but in responding to situations. Tell us why yes and is a more powerful phrase.
I think that every person who is 5 years or older should take a class in improv. Yes, and is one of the
Hmm.
best rules that we could learn. When we use the word but or no at a brain level, that immediately stops a conversation. It halts it. And people think, well, if I say yes and, then I'm giving in to that other person. I'm agreeing to something I don't want to agree to. But when you effectively learn to use yes and, it continues to move the conversation forward, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you are having to give up and give in to that other person. It continues to move that conversation forward. When we use improv, again, which I think is something that everybody would benefit from knowing, another piece of that is to embrace our mistakes because we're so afraid of making a mistake. And when we are dealing with another person, to just embrace that, be transparent, a little bit of vulnerability, that actually increases our ability to uh, increase that trust. Anybody who has followed Brene Brown, and she talks about vulnerability and how it really can move a relationship forward because of that trust issue. And one of the rules of yes and improv that I really love is about making the other person or persons in a troop situation um, look as good or better than you. You're not putting the focus on yourself and trying to be the hero. You are setting that other person up for success. And when we do that, a rising tide raises all boats. And so, with those rules of yes and, to keep the conversation moving forward and to embrace the mistakes and to make that other person look and feel better, you've created this wonderful combination of circumstances that's really going to be beneficial to everybody. It's a win-win.
A lot of nursing, Karyn, I think, is rooted in improv,
Yeah,
which
it really is.
we may not call it improv, but we may refer to it as being able to think on your feet in unpredictable situations, which often arise in healthcare.
Yes.
When improv training and acting is more formalized, I know very little about this. I have a relative in Brooklyn who had an improv theater many years ago, and I went to see one of the performances, and it was absolutely astounded because they would ask the audience to throw out a word or a phrase or a scenario, and then they built an entire scene around what the audience just gave them, and it was coherent and logical, and it made sense, and it was entertaining. They even came up with rhymes that worked. It was phenomenal. We do that in a much less structured way when we're taking care of patients, or we're taking care of our attorney clients and they are interacting with us, and we have to be able to use critical thinking, listen, think on our feet, react, reassure, show our knowledge in a way that helps them trust us,
Yes.
and throw in a little bit of humor at the same time, which attorneys, in my experience, love to know from their consultants. How does healthcare actually operate?
That's a really broad statement. So when you say, how does healthcare actually operate? Could you
Sure.
maybe go a
Perfect
little further?
example. WNL. What does WNL mean on a lab slip?
I don't even know right now. I'm sorry to say.
Well, it typically means within normal limits.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
But
Yes.
if you take a sarcastic perspective, it means we never looked.
Oh,
And attorneys absolutely love that. It gives them a little window between understanding how healthcare functions and how they can use that in litigating cases.
yes.
I know that you and I talked about a method called SCARE that I wanted to cover before we run out of time in terms of how we can use that model in our interactions with our clients. And let's cover that and then tell our listener how they can find out more about you and the services you offer.
Okay. Scare is something that I learned from uh, an expert. His name is David Rock. And he came up with this when he realized that there are certain things that throw us into a brain threat. And when we or the person we're serving is in a brain threat, um, it really hinders our ability to get toward our desired outcome. And this is an acronym. So S stands for status, and that means that there is some type of hierarchy. And it could be something as big as somebody who holds a position higher than you. It might be your boss. It might be somebody who has a lot of money. It might be somebody who has a better car than you. It might be somebody as benign as somebody having a better hair day than you, or it has a better looking spouse or whatever. I mean, it can be really silly. It's in the mind of the beholder what that hierarchy is. And when somebody feels that hierarchy, then that again throws them into a brain threat. One of the things that's nice about humor, it's a double-edged sword. It can create hierarchy, but it can also, when used in a positive way, it can lower the hierarchy and create a level playing field. C stands for certainty. And our brain craves certainty. The whole binging industry has been built upon this, that it's like, oh, we get to the end of one episode and it's like, I gotta know what happens next. And so you go right to the next thing. During COVID, this was one of the things that just set everybody's hair on fire because we didn't know for certain. How is the virus spread? How is it contained? Is this going to be helpful, or are vaccines going to help or not help, or masks or whatever? There was so much uncertainty. And again, with humor, we can't necessarily use that to provide the certainty, but we can use humor to de-escalate when the brain is on fire because of that lack of certainty. But we certainly can do things to help people feel more certainty. That also goes in a little bit to the next one, which is A for autonomy. And that is the brain's resistance to, don't you tell me what to do. And so when we can work with our patients or our clients or the lawyers or whomever to co-create, because people are going to support what they create and they also have more certainty about what is going to happen, then that's another way we can lower that brain threat. R stands for relatedness. And this is because we are social beings. We may be educated or we may be socialized to be less social. And I know right now, with so many devices keeping us from connecting, we lose some of that. But we are biologically designed to connect to others. And when we are disconnected, that can throw the brain into a brain threat. The wonderful thing about humor when used strategically is it is a way to build that connection with another person. And I love teaching folks about how to use that and strengthen connection through stories and through anecdotes and through observational comments and such. And then E is equality. People want to be treated fairly. And how can we do that? And how can we assure them that they're being treated in a fair manner? And it's like, why is that other person being served before me in the ER, with triage? Or why does this person have a better paying insurance than I do. I don't know. I mean, there's all different kinds of ways that we could look at equality. And again, when the brain is on fire, using a little bit of humor to lower that temperature, whether again through a comment or an observation or a story. There's a lot of ways that when we use humor intentionally with somebody, or even for ourselves, we don't have to be an entertainer. This is the biggest misconception that I see, is that people equate using humor with being funny. And if there's one thing that I would love for the listeners to take away today about humor, is that it's more important to see funny, to be an observer of humor, to be an appreciator of humor. It's more important to see funny than it is to be funny.
That model helps us keep our perspective.
Yes.
I remember watching a TV interviewer talking to a man who was pushing a shopping cart in a store, and he had just lost all of his possessions in some fire, flood, tragedy. And he looked at the interviewer and he said, "This is a shopper's dream. I get to buy everything new." And I listened to him and I thought, that's a whole different way of reacting than
Different perspective.
lost everything. Oh my goodness, what am I going to do to rebuild my life? And instead, he was finding the joy in that little moment of being able to come to grips with what had happened to him. That was the certainty. He lost all the certainty in his life, but he knew he had a credit card in his pocket and he could go into that store and buy things that he needed.
Yes. Reframing is one of the best psychological tools to help us cope that we have. One of the challenges with that is that it does take a lot of cognitive energy for the brain to reframe and see something from a different perspective. The beautiful thing about practicing humor on a regular basis is that we are looking at things that are typically disconnected and connecting them. And that is, it's the secret sauce. It's a superpower that eventually you learn to be able to see things and reframe them very quickly. So it's humor is a bit of a humor shortcut or a humor hack in terms of that reframing. But you're spot on, spot on.
Karyn, I know that our viewer has gotten a little window into your world and may be hungry for more. What would be the best way for our viewer or our listener to find out more about the resources that you provide?
I have a link tree link that I will give to you, and you can put in the comments. But Linktree, if you're not familiar with it, it's linktr.ee/Karyn Buxman, and it's Karyn with a Y. And that has just all of the different ways, because I love being connected to people on social media, on LinkedIn, on Facebook. I'm creating a movement right now for happy, healthy nurses. And I've got some information that you can find on Linktree on that, as well as an 8-week course that I'll be doing. It'll be coming up again in October, called The Missing Piece. And we go into depth on things like humor and conflict, humor and improv, humor and connection, using it intentionally for influence and intentionally for well-being, and not necessarily for entertainment.
Thank you, Karyn, so much for sharing your perspective. I'm going to spell your name for people who are listening. Karyn. Buxman is Buxman. Karyn is a doctorally prepared nurse, a neuro humorist, a speaker, a great resource, and as you can tell, has had her tour through the healthcare world in several different specialties before becoming an entrepreneur and an educator and a speaker, helping us all keep our perspective, understanding more about how the brain works and how humor can help us get through some tough times.
Yeah. yeah, if there was one thing that I would encourage you to do, coming away from this conversation, is to think about stimulus response. What can you put in that space? And using humor by choice, not just by chance, because it is so powerful. It was the idea of something fun that drew me to this field, but it's been the power of humor that has kept me in this field for over 40 years.
And luckily, there are no shortage of situations where your need to maintain your sense of humor is paramount.
Exactly. Well, I really appreciate this, Pat. It's been an honor.
Thank you, Karyn, and thank you to you who has been part of this conversation, and I'll see you on the next show.